let's I guess start with what you're doing. Which is a lot of things, because I want to talk about Zineopolis as well as Future Fantastic. How and when and why did that come about?
Zineopolis started around about 2007 because I had a vast collection of zines and comics, self-published material by students, staff, and other practitioners in the field. And I really had nowhere to put it or catalogue it or store it, and it felt like lots of disparate elements. So through research, I found that zines was a thing, and it seemed to be much more sort of understood and researched in America. Actually, there's a lot of established zine collections. So sort of taking a lead from there, I set up Zineopolis as an art zine collection that we could house at Portsmouth. I wanted to capture that material and kind of keep it for future researchers, keep it so that I could use it in teaching and learning. And I also was making zines as part of my own research as an illustrator, as a visual practitioner. So once the zine collection had started, we rapidly got up to 300 or 400 artifacts, editions of 50 or editions of 10, and in some cases just one-offs. So it's a sort of remarkable collection that grew very quickly. I run MA illustration as well. So I'm tending to look for zines that have high visual content. So generally the visuals will be of a larger proportion than the text.
Yes.
Some will be visual only, so they may include comics, narrative sequences, cartoons, artworks, occasionally illustrated poetry, but generally it's much more sort of visual communicators.
This amazing collection that you've got. I mean, you say that it's like a conservation piece, really. It's a record, it's keeping them, so it's kind of looking after their past, but how is it also kind of securing the future for zines?
I mean, many of these items are quite ephemeral in nature, so many of them are kind of would be made and gifted to a friend and may be kept or may be lost. So it's kind of quite fleeting, and quite a lot of the stories are quite personal. So they may be intended for just one other person to look at. So actually trying to archive and store them so that they're available for future researchers is quite important. And one thing I have sought to do is put everything through the Zineopolis blog, though. So everything has got a digital record, photographed indicative scans and covers, all of this with permission from the makers. So if they also have a connection to a website or an Instagram, I've sought to include that. So I feel like I've been connected to everybody that's either donated work to the collection or that we purchased for the collection. It really does feel like a network of people. We've got sort of zines that talk about things like Brexit, but they're also talking about key issues in the UK, so the credit crunch, historical issues, because they're so contemporary, and people make them and can publish them within days, essentially. You can make a zine very quickly. Unlike academic publishing, you can get a real feeling of mood and a flavour of the time from them.
In a way, they're kind of, by curating them, their level of, like, even though they're a fleeting moment, they're kind of their longevity is there, and therefore, you know, that kind of, I guess, importance as a record and through the whole process of actually collecting them.
And it's interesting, you know, where people are making zines, which are kind of personal zines. So it's much more about a personal story. But of course, we all tell our personal stories responding to the context that we're in. So quite often things like sort of mental health or well-being issues have come up, and especially over, you know, COVID and the lockdown, ways people have dealt with isolation or the way they've sort of dealt with quarantine. You know, that's come through in personal stories. So again, looking back on that, you'll get a very personal angle rather than a sort of corporate or a government angle. There are so many voices within the collection. It's not been edited by anyone. So lots of people speaking.
Did you have any idea when you kind of started collecting them as that it would grow to be such a significant and massive kind of undertaking? Not
really. I think I was collecting them because I was worried about them disappearing. So I kind of felt they were so sort of ephemeral. It's the same reason when people collect tickets, you sort of collect things to remember. So I was almost collecting them to remember, and to remember student work and projects, and to remember things other people had made. And I was quite surprised how excited the students were by this, because we actually sort of brought in zine-based projects almost like the sense of permission for people to be able to make work and publish it and distribute it themselves without having to go through a third party or an editor or a publisher. And it was the feeling of liberation that I can just say what I want and I can get that out into the public domain.
Yes.
It's quite grown up on one hand, but also quite radical in that you can kind of change the narrative about how you're seen. So fascinating with things like, say, mental health issues. People can tell a story that's maybe not so familiar through the mainstream. Since we're in a university, I sort of have a lot of students between sort of 19 and 25. But again, that age group, they're less published because, the gatekeepers don't really listen to the voices of that particular age group. So actually having zines means that there's somewhere where they can see other people talk about issues that they're interested in. So it's been fascinating, actually.
I thought that was really interesting when I was reading the paper that you wrote about the zine's role in mental health issues, and that it was that personal perspective that was really powerful on a kind of broader level. Like you just see that it's a very personal thing, but it can connect so broadly with other people too.
I mean, that's been a really interesting area of research, and it has grown recently. So graphic medicine is a sort of international conference where visual narratives around mental health are kind of being explored more sort of seriously. So that's including zines, comics, artists, illustrators, etc., but also sort of medical professionals and coming together. I'm working with people from UCLAN, which is Lancaster University. The people I'm working with are Helen Spandler and Jill Anderson. They both work in mental health and looking at survivor stories through Asylum magazine, which is a regular magazine that includes work from professionals, but also from people, service users, essentially, or carers and survivors. So some of those sort of lived experience stories, they're really difficult to see in places. So zines and Asylum magazines are one of the few places where you can almost hear the voice of someone else telling you their actual experiences. Otherwise all you've got is sort of, I suppose, medical information, like sort of hospital leaflets. And that's really just telling people what to do, but not necessarily connecting them with their emotion or their experiences. So being able to read people's journeys, and sometimes they can be really hard stories to read. It's not easy. They're not all going to have happy ending, but actually just being able to have that understanding and communication with another human is really valuable. A really nice story about a student made a zine called Panic, and this one is about post-traumatic stress disorder. And the zine is really beautifully illustrated with little incidents that no one tells you. So, for example, one of the illustrations was about smartphones. If you're undergoing a panic attack, it's really difficult to make a smartphone work because you can't get the touch button to work, or your hands are too sweaty for the touch button to work, or you can't see clear enough to put the code in. So actually, as an emergency phone, it's really quite bad in some scenarios.
Yes.
And that's little incidents like that you would not get in a public information leaflet. He did share his work online and was actually very generous in sharing this very personal experience, but with a wider audience, for the point of trying to help other people. It comes from a very sort of generous, positive space. But this was also picked up by Mental Health England, and they interviewed the student and then promoted the work on their website. So it went out to more of their sort of teen catchment that they were looking to. So strangely, something that started personal as a zine became something that was much more widely published and circulated.
Speaking to the power of the medium itself, one of the questions that I had, I kind of jumped ahead of myself, and you've kind of answered the question about what is it about this medium itself that makes it so special and so important and so different from other mediums.
The connection with the author. I mean, in our case, it's author, illustrator, or author, artist, but it's a very direct connection because there is no mediator, there's no censorship, there's no one between you and the voice of the person talking. Their moods, their journey and their sort of experiences can go directly into your hands. And the lovely thing about the zines, many of them are printed. We have mostly sort of print versions. So they really do feel like quite a special moment and a connection with someone else. If it's an artifact that can be carried, it can be shared. Some of them are actually meant to be sort of shared and swapped or given away as gifts. Younger people are quite often cut out of traditional publishing. So, we've got zines for sort of school children upwards. Where else would they be able to publish and share work? again, they're in total control of the vehicle. So they're designing the look, the story, the content, the illustration. It's really quite lovely to actually be able to see that. We touched on mental health a bit earlier, but there's a comment from Gemma Corral. She works in this area, and we have got some of her work in the collection. But in a recent interview for Graphic Medicine, she did say that she's found that she's heard some people say that when they can't explain something to their doctor very clearly, they could take the zine or the cartoon or the drawing to say, this is how I'm feeling. Because sometimes we can't say very sort of personal or emotional things in words. Not all of us can. Whereas sometimes the illustration can do it.
Yep, that's fantastic. And the third party can take that along, that very personal thing, and then use it to explain something that they can't put words into. That whole idea of not being able to put words or represent things through words as well is this where the art scene really kind of has its place, being able to illustrate things through images.
It really does. And as well as it sort of being able to help communicate to everyone through pictures, there are a lot of us that tend to understand things through images more readily than through text. So visual learners or people that are sort of more visually orientated. And I did a sequence of illustrations about burnout a while ago. And again, they were sort of not really cartoons and not really illustrations, but kind of a mix of words and images to explain sort of feelings of pressure, work stress, etc. And I shared that online as part of my own practice. But that was taken up by a group of psychologists that said they'd like to use it in sessions with patients, again, to help people understand or be able to verbalise things. Picture of somebody trying to hold a pile of balls, and as they're trying to hold them, clutch them to themselves, they keep falling down and they keep picking them up and trying to put them back on. And just trying to encapsulate that idea, I suppose, modern living idea, when there are too many things going on and you can't keep track of it all,
I know the feeling.
Strangely, I think it's all too common for us, isn't it, these sort of things? And there's sort of another illustration that proved quite popular was a character being hit by Google Gmail icons, and so they were sort of running, sort of yelling that the icons are falling, And it's interesting because I've also been fascinated with the way we can use humour to explain sort of emotion, and so especially things to do with mental well-being. Again, when we're looking at things like sort of stress or burnout, using kind of elements of humour to take the alarm out of the situation, but to give people a different coping mechanism. Used carefully, it can make people sort of feel a bit more in control again of their situation.
And also that it's a shared experience. It's not just you alone.
I think that's the important thing with zines, is that they are made to share. So, although it might be that you're sharing with a very small group of people, or it might be just your friends, or maybe just your family that you're trying to share something with. Quite often, people share much more broadly than that. So they might share through things like Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, etc. But really, it is that idea of sort of connecting to a group of people that also understand or may feel they need help. I've got some really nice examples of things like sort of zines about general anxiety disorder, and some of them are made much more to help. So they're like a replacement leaflet, and they're meant for a bigger circulation. Whereas some are much more personal, so they're really only meant for one other person or your family. Yeah, it can be quite difficult because on one hand, I mean, there's sort of stories about people photoshopping their house tidier before sharing pictures on social media. So there's the pressure of how we appear to others. Whereas I think zine seems to manage to get around that, because especially if you're taking control of the artwork or illustrations or photography, you're kind of in control as to how much you release or how much you don't. And some are really, incredibly honest, and you feel very sort of privileged that someone's allowing you to read their personal story. But there seems to be something quite liberating for the makers in that maybe it is about putting control back into that personal story. If that is your story to share and it's your story to, illustrate, and you're in control of the narrative, rather than always being swept along by, circumstances or organisations or institutions.
Mental health issues or anything like that, that's one area where they can be really powerful, but they're kind of looking at society, a reflection of society, commentary on society, that kind of thing. Are there themes that kind of emerge in the collection?
Yeah, there are recently. I mean, we've had a lot of zines looking at environmental issues, which spin-offs from that means we're looking at a lot of animal welfare zines. So there's quite a lot about sort of veganism or factory farming, meat production. There's a really lovely one called The Foul Egg that's about battery chicken farming. You know, the sequence is an illustrated narrative from the point of view of the chicken. And so it's a really lovely, almost like a children's story, but with a very dark theme running through it. Is great for making people change their opinions. I mean, it really is quite a shocking story as it sort of unfolds. But on that, we've also got quite a few zines that look at things like either nutrition. Veganism is becoming, you know, much more, people are much more aware of it. So there's a lot of recipe zines. Politics always features. There's a lot of politics and society. There are some that are just meant to be funny, you know, like a comic. The main aim is to just share laughter. So you're kind of reading jokes and we're looking at humour. So there's kind of a whole sort of gamut of things that are going on in there. One of the nicest things is to just go into the collection and kind of pick things up by random and just browse, you know, to see what you get. You know, I just catalogued one that was by Holly Cassio, which is a lovely zine, but it's all about Iron Brew, you know, the drink.
Oh, right.
So why I love Iron Brew. And it's so nice to read that and then have other things next to it about different issues. You know, it's just like a snapshot of thoughts and feelings.
Does technology, is it kind of, obviously it's been a great resource for you to be able to have a home for the collection that's really easily accessible. So how has it changed zines over the time that you've been involved with them? Is it kind of making it easier or more difficult, or what are the challenges?
It's funny, things kind of are changing. So zines really started to become really popular with the invention of the photocopier. So basically, you know, somebody had a photocopier at work and it suddenly means that you can now be a printer, whereas before that you had to pay for a printer. So photocopiers essentially liberated, you know, people in terms of making publications. Then you add to that sort of desktop publishing, that you've got software that means that people can lay out and they can digitize, you know, which is wonderful, actually. It does mean that it becomes so much easier for people to be able to reproduce things and essentially put it into a sequence and print it. So then we've kind of go into more sort of social media where the actual sharing of this now becomes possible in a much wider sense. So rather than sharing among a sort of niche group, and quite often things like sort of feminist zines or punk zines or music zines, they might have been shared within a group of fans or a group of friends. Suddenly with, you know, Facebook, etc., you can now share with the whole world, can't you? So it's quite a different kind of feeling. There's still quite a lot of collections that are wholly based on print. And although I have got some PDF zines, and there has been more of that, especially in the pandemic year, as you can imagine, it seems like people still prefer a tangible artifact that you can hold in your hands. Maybe it's the connection, and maybe it's, you know, we still hang on to real books as well for the same reason. There's something quite tactile about the smell and the feel of a book and the touch of the paper in your hands. But we have seen more digital work coming through, even in the print versions. A lot of the material inside has been created digitally. Procreate is a software that seems to be really running away with it for artists at the moment. It's so very easy to use. If you have a tablet, you can sort of sit anywhere, be anywhere, and you can draw very professionally. You know, you can have all the brushes, all the pens. Whereas on the train, it was a bit of a pain having a bag full of felt tip pens. You know. I must admit, I do both. So I draw digitally and I draw physically.
Right. So technology, you know, isn't kind of spelling the end of this beautiful handmade kind of product.
No, it's kind of making some things easier, but it's at the same time, it's also making people more interested in actual tactile products as well. So you can make something online that has a filter that makes it look like a lino print, but there's something quite exciting when you make an actual lino print and it smells and it's physical and you make mistakes and I think the thing about making mistakes is they're the bits that are that show that a human has made it. The aura, where it's the aura of an actual thing that's been made by a human being. So it's kind of associated with artworks generally, like paintings. But with zines, although they're maybe gone through a photocopier or a laser printer, you still feel like someone has folded them, bound them, stapled them, signed them, drawn on or added stickers or other elements. So you still go back to a connection, even though it might have been generally printed, but you still feel like it's been through a human being.
That's so beautiful. Thank you so
Thank you.
much. It's been an absolute pleasure to meet you and learn about your work. Thanks, Jac.
Yes, and thanks for making it easy.
Oh, no worries. Cheers. Bye.
Cheerio. Bye-bye.